So essentially, this is a combination of three different ideas: the how to level up, a historical analysis of different societies, and transitional development. It fits into what we're talking about. The levels exist in terms of like being like steps, or with spiral dynamics. They're stages that encompass the previous stage. Part of that is you have to go through and do personal growth and knowledge and perspective. And as you do that, you're working on personal develop in more of a intellectual way, as opposed to one that's just emotional or physical. It's not always a steady growth. In fact, like one of the observations I made is societies, and this is something that I got from Kim Wilber, is the ideas of societies kind of go through these stages as well. And societies both progress and regress as they develop. In fact, I'll go over some historical examples of what I think are different examples of stages of development and how societies have done that, and how that's sometimes a step backwards can become a leap forwards in terms of your cognitive ego development. Each of the stages serves as like a foundation, which is like a perspective that you start off with when you're in that stage, and then different experiences or knowledge or things that happen to you change you to have a different perspective. And this is part of growing as humans. I think that this is something that we equate with wisdom. And I think that a lot of very wise people, at least our perception of what wisdom is, are typically people who were very advanced in ego development. And basically the way that a lot of people do that, and keep in mind, I didn't generate these images, this was all AI. So I don't know what this is on this one, that person with a weird shaped object on their head. But self-reflection is a good way of kind of understanding or meta thinking. I think he talks about thinking, studying different perspectives, cultures. One of the things that I had a discussion in Level Check with somebody, she was, her parents, her dad was from Russia and her mom was American, and she had two different cultures growing up, and it gave her more of a synthesis perspective that these are different ways of seeing the world. And I think that studying can help that in terms of like learning philosophy, culture, perspective. I think that college does a good job of that in terms of getting people to like that level 6 perspective. And then community engagement, learning from other people, and then like spending time being interconnected with the world around you. With each transition, you're kind of going through like a shift, and some of the shifts are easier than others. Essentially, you start off questioning. For instance, 4 to 5 is a good example. When I was 4, ironically, I think that a lot of people, they go through a religious stage where they start to question their religiosity, why they believe the things that they do, and this is more of a dissolution phase for people at level 4. And then they hit level 5, which is more the rational stage. And at the rational stage, there tends to be a rejection of 4, and before you fully integrate 4 into your new 5 perspective. And I think that that's why when I was like 16, I was a very hyper online debater about religion. I didn't particularly like organized religion, even though now I'm a more of a spiritual person. It was from the rational perspective of kind of rejecting my 4 way of thinking and incorporating my 5 as my new persona, right? And I think that that's what the reconstruction phase is. And then each time you do this, you experience cognitive dissonance. You see a lot of people, they'll hold 2 different views that are exact, like they can't be synthesized, exclude each other. And I think that you start to feel lost, you start to question your identity. And I see this as a actually useful tool in terms of like learning about the levels, because a lot of people, they go through these things and they don't know why they're experiencing what they're experiencing, and they don't have a point of reference, because this isn't something that's taught in schools, this isn't something that's taught in institutions, this is something that people have kind of just had to figure out on their own. And I think that therapy is only so helpful. A lot of times I think that people sometimes get pointed towards that direction and get misdiagnosed as to what they're experiencing. In order to level up, you have to identify what are things that block your thinking in terms of like incorporating those different levels and seeing the validity in what they potentially offer. And then what happens is you can find support and resources and community, and I think that's what a lot of us have done here, and a lot of us have had to do that through conversations. Basically, you go through uncertainty, you have to seek out support systems and reflect, and I think that's how most of us have just intuitively moved through the levels. There is like a shadow side to development. You can easily get into regressive thinking, echo chambers. What's funny is conspiracy thinking is on here, and I'm somebody who is more a fan of conspiracy thinking. It defines it as an attempt to create meaning through oversimplified explanations of complex phenomenon, when I think most people would actually take the opposite, that you kind of overthink more simplistic points of view. So I don't necessarily agree with this. I think that what at the heart of what conspiracy thinking is making connections, and sometimes not being grounded in an objective reality. It goes back to the levels because there's subjective preference in terms of your thinking. And I think you could see conspiracy thinking because it's more of a rejection of 5, or the more rational level, which I find interesting. And then so individual and collective work, understanding like the importance of both your personal growth, but also like your growth outside of yourself. And I think that oftentimes people who are very centered at 5 tend to be very focused on the self and not focused on what's outside of the self. And there's challenges, and this is probably a superfluous slide. And so this is a redo of the other one, I think. Yeah. See, and then there's horizontal and vertical development in the levels, in my opinion. I think that Hughes was a really good example of somebody who inhabits 5 a lot. And then I think that there are other people who kind of vacillate through the levels, and I think that's just because they haven't solidified their perspective. And for growing through the levels, it's actually somewhat helpful to not have a solidified persona of what you think your perspective is, because it's probably easier to change it, but it also makes it less consistent. And I think that we've all observed that, where you could be having a conversation with someone who is a 9 and all of a sudden they go to like 4, right? So there's that. And then reflection, community development, education is, I think, a big part of it, having the idea of systems thinking and how to integrate different ideas, and knowing that there are multiple perspectives on things. And let's see, self-awareness, meditation. A lot of people in Level Check practice meditation as they're going through the levels. And this kind of goes off to like the start of the leveling up. So like obviously egocentric stage, and kind of like our base of existence when we first start off in the world. And then there's needs that we have and emotional regulation that we're working through. And essentially you start to develop tools to deal with being less self-centered and understanding other people's perspective. And you can move through those stages very quickly. There's some kids I feel like get to stage 4 sometimes before some adults. And I look at this as like a development of humanity as a whole. Like in early pre-humans, we start off as tribalistic creatures. And I think that we probably existed at 1 through 3 for the most part. But I do think that the people who are perceived as more enlightened tended to get to 5 or 6 or even 7, even in ancient times. And I think that those were the philosophers and the people who, even the mystics or the priests who had a deeper understanding that there are truths and then there are deeper truths, right? And then so one of the things was during ancient Greece, you had systemic questioning, the Socratic method, new ways of thinking. The base, I think, of most human societies tended to be around tribal consciousness. And so group identity, kind of loyalty to each other. We see this in modern times with like football, right? Sports. And there's a transition from egocentrism to like a group-centric perspective. And then it's good for societies because then you have loyalty to your society. You have appreciation for your traditions and your collective understanding. And then you start to also incorporate the perspective of like these things are, good, but then there's also the downside of you get into ideas like us versus them thinking, rejection of outgroups, and having a limited perspective beyond your own culture and perspective of your group. And then Greek philosophy kind of like I said, challenged some of those ideas. You have like the city-states in ancient Greece, where there was a form of, like religiosity in terms of like the city-state being part of a level 4 perspective, but also individualism started in ancient Greece, and that was more of a level 5 perspective. And then rational consciousness is usually where 5 is, and you can usually tell societies that reach rational consciousness because there was more of a systematic way of thinking and approach to society and even their cultures. And it's from deductive reasoning, logical analysis, even the scientific method has actually come up several times throughout history. And then the European Renaissance was a really good example. And a lot of this goes back to like the hierarchy of needs and self-actualization. I think that when you get to self-actualization, you get to move past level 4 easier than somebody who is not self-actualized. Although I'm sure there's people who still achieve higher levels even at, not having all their needs met. And then the challenges of rational consciousness is that you tend to overcorrect and reject different forms of knowledge if it doesn't, kind of fall into the rational perspective. Dismissal of subjectivity, or whether or not it's important to have subjective experience, and the idea of a collective wisdom or concepts of, I do this where somebody will tell me, hey, I put a medicine on that has nothing to do with what they're doing, neglecting the fact that there are things like like placebo effects. And then expanding perspectives beyond the rational stage is you start to one of the important parts of the rational stage is the value of objective truth. And we value rejective truth so much that we tend to even dismiss subjective or even collective truths. And the idea of almost like worshiping the objective truth, it becomes a problem at 5. And you could say that it's a good thing to have objective truth, and that's true, and objective reality is important, but you also have to understand that there are things beyond just objective reality. And the idea of it's more of a hyper-rationalization drawback of level 5. And then characteristics of rational consciousness or systematic thinking, abstract reasoning, empirical focus, and we saw that with the Enlightenment. And then Industrial Revolution was another one. There's multiple levels of development, and you have to be able to balance out some of the challenges at the rational stage. And then what happens after 5 is 6, which is in Ken Wilber's system. It's the green meme. Green in spiral dynamics is about like cultural relativism. It's about the revisit of the communal subjective experience from level 4, and this is the pattern I observed. 4 and 6 tend to rhyme with each other, and then 5 and 7 tend to rhyme with each other, and I think that has to do with like the shift from subjective and objective and individualistic versus collective consciousness and what we value, and essentially developing I can't say that word. Pluralistic awareness is important. You have to understand the world beyond yourself, and part of why I think this stage exists is to kind of draw us into the importance and kind of revisit why society exists and the society beyond our own. And this is, recognition of multiple valid perspectives is actually the important truth from this stage, is that there are more than just one perspective on things. The suspension of judgment tends to be a downside of this because you get into moral relativism and cultural relativity, which is the attempt to contextualize the truth but loses sight of the importance of a objective perception. And see here, decision paralysis, another part of it is if nothing is true, then everything is a lie, right? And then if everything is true, what do we believe? And I think that goes into part of the problem is that you start talking about like morality with somebody who has like cultural relativism. They tend to kind of blow up their own arguments sometimes because they can't see past the idea or the worship of the idea that everything is all relative to the individual, and we get into like a lot of ideas of opinions and whether or not there are objective opinions. And I think that that's part of this stage is it makes it hard to make decisions. We see this as a society. In my opinion, most people who are college graduates tend to get to six, level five or level six. And I think that I call this like the Twitter experience. Like people tend to get very overwhelmed by trying to assess all these different points of view, and they have emotional and mental fatigue from it. Another good example of history is you see this in Islam when they go through this period of almost like an enlightenment period with especially in Cordoba, and they have these ideas of integrating Western knowledge with Eastern knowledge and kind of achieving more of a higher stage of development as opposed to the rest of the world during the Dark Ages. And in India, they also had, India is a much older society, so I think that a lot of it has to do with their religious, or for being a Buddhist perspective, they tend to integrate different concepts beyond the level 4. And I think that India at certain points was also closer to like an integral society, but everything is progressive where it's not always a steady march of progress. And I think that self-questioning consciousness, systems thinking with postmodernism is something that we've struggled with in our society, because we start to devalue things that are productive. And I think that the integral revolution is from Ken Wilber's theory. And essentially, like, we get to that point in integral theory where we start to transcend the earlier stages and kind of incorporate all the value from the different stages. And that's level 7. And essentially, you start to be able to synthesize diverse perspectives into a coherent whole, and kind of get to the level 8, level 9 perspective, which is like unity of experience and transcending the ego, which goes back to rhyming. 8 most likely would rhyme with 6 in this perspective. But I also think that once you reach the integral stage, you tend to just understand the importance of each of the different levels below it. I mean, I think that once you get to level 8 and 9, you start to integrate the shadow more. And I think that that's very valuable in terms of like cognitive development and understanding the importance of different perspectives beyond just, like what's immediate. And a lot of this is just kind of going over the other stages. And then, let's see. Yeah, and then essentially, like, as a society, why I thought the level up, how to level up thing was important is the more tools that we give people and help them reach these higher perspectives where they're able to see things more clearly. I think that would be a betterment to society. And I think that most of the times when we've reached golden ages of advancement, it was a large number of people in a very small area for different, systemic or cultural reasons, were able to reach these higher perspectives. And I think that understanding the reasoning behind each level, and then the importance it has and what it teaches us and what we learn from it, and then why the other levels exist and what we get from them, allows people to at least cognitively get to the higher levels. And whether or not they actually learn the lessons of those, they're aware of them. And I think that that's in itself a valuable perspective. So, and thank you guys for listening to me ramble. So feel free, Odolev, if you have a perspective on it, let me know.
Alright, so a couple things to note. For one, I want to get this one out of the way. There is a bit of an issue with regard to trying to confer the concepts that are derived at a relatively high level to ones that are lower level, to those that don't operate at those higher levels, simply because the way in which concepts are conferred to someone depends on the degree of complexity that that person is capable of comprehending with regards to that idea at any given moment. And If you look around, you'll notice that history is just littered with examples of what could be referred to as hyper-normalization. This is where a concept is sort of simplified to the point of being wrong, as it is typically referred to, or in this case, it is simplified to the point where it no longer faithfully retains what it was before. It is something else. It is something else completely that simply superficially resembles the concepts we talk about in question. Which is why I'm a bit skeptical about this idea that if society were to, for example, successfully operate at level 7, that this would mean that we would have a habit of slowly but surely bringing people up to that level as a matter of operation, simply because whether you move up might not necessarily be up to you half the time. It could be that because of your circumstances, it's a lot easier for you to stay at a certain level instead of moving up because nothing is really challenging your ability to operate at that level. And this is the case in our societies today all the time. Like in a way, despite how modern the way our countries are run, and the lives we lead, you'd expect, if that we were even trying to educate people up to thinking in a very level 5 sort of way, but despite that, people make their way through this exact education system, and by the end, they're not even at that level 5. As much as they hear about the importance of thinking critically about this and that, how how they need to take all these variables into account, and so on and so forth. It's entirely possible for someone to go through the motions of something like this without actually comprehending why it works the way it does, is my point. So that's something important to bear in mind with regards to moving up the levels. It requires, in a way, a critical failure in the way in which you're operating in the world for you to seek something else out of desperation. That's typically how moving up the levels tends to happen. At least that is in terms of what I've observed in myself and others, in terms of their recollections. And there was this other thing. Oh, well, if you want to comment on that, go ahead right now. Actually.
Yeah, I agree that what I've observed is you do get individuals that have a really good cognitive understanding of the levels. And when you see how they interact with people, they don't actually apply them, right? I think that goes to your point of like if they haven't been challenged or experienced the things that they need to do to actually know why the levels exist and what they get from those levels and why they're useful. It's kind of like giving somebody, actually this is a good analogy for myself. I have a big toolbox and I don't know what half those damn things do. But I know that they're useful for something. I just have never had to use them, right? So that's I see your perspective. I think that all we can really do is give people the tools and give them the knowledge, and whether or not they have to or don't apply that knowledge is really going to depend on their individual circumstances. I just think that a good example is you see this with college people applying their education through their lived experience oftentimes misapply what they've learned. But I think that that's part of the process of how we change as humans. We have these experiences. We have a collection of previous experiences that we create an engram that we use, or like a schema for how we handle those situations. And then if it's useful, we keep it. And if it's not useful, we don't keep it. And I think that what happens sometimes, especially in regards to societies and the levels and also individuals, is they encounter situations where the concept is not useful in that particular situation. And what it does is it collectively creates a regression towards like a previous level, or more of a rejection of that progress. And I think that part of my experiences from writing, there's the hero's journey, and a part of the hero's journey is actually rejecting your actual like what you're supposed to do. And I think that humans do that often, and I think that's usually what causes regression both in individuals and in society.
Yeah, that's I think there's certainly some merit to that idea. I mean, I'd argue that regression can have other causes. It could be that the systems that are in place are so complex to operate within that resorting to a measure of what we can fancifully call magical thinking is suddenly a lot more effective than actually comprehending what's happening at each step. There are a few ways for that to happen as well. But another thing that I want to mention is specifically that while the odd and even levels do resemble each other, this resemblance is, at least to my understanding, more superficial than it seems at first glance when it comes to certain ways in which they engage with the world. For example, the collective subjective directions of 4 and 6, which were mentioned earlier, as an example of how this rhyming effect can occur, are something of an example of this, in that like the way the collective subjective of 4 works is that it is specifically a form of collective coherence, which is to say that it requires a measure of information about the way the world works, which allows for at least something of a restriction to be placed on the way in which you get to value things or interpret the world around you. And it is specifically within these restrictions that the collective sense of identity that you find at level 4 has to operate. Whereas what you find in level 6 is something else. It's something that rejects the informational structure that would require you to consider the way in which the world operates in a restricted manner, within the context of how we understand it to be precisely, and it is indeed open to the world being some other way because of the limited nature of our understanding, and that because it gets to be some other way, it is more important to hear, to listen to and understand how people evaluate the world around them, and to form such a consensus on ways to separate between different things and differentiate between them and evaluate them a million different ways as well, which would be called collective significance in my model. It's a very different kind of knowledge that it can indeed be converted into collective coherence through application, but in doing so, it sort of gets in the way of the way in which such collective coherence at level 4 is formed. There's actually a lot of friction between these two levels as a result of this, where people that are willing to you'll often find level 6s that express themselves freely in such absurd ways that typically have the more religious and conservative level 4s clutching their pearls about the whole thing. There's certain irreverence to the way level 6 operates in an attempt to sort of get to the bottom of a lot of issues like this. And that irreverence isn't really out of a sense of abandoning the collective in favor of the individual, but rather to assert that the current way in which the collective is organized is inadequate to serve the interests of the individuals within that collective, in a sense.
Yeah.
Something that level 4 doesn't address effectively.
Yeah, I think a lot of
There is less of a synergy between those two levels than it appears at first glance. That's what I want to know.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that 4 and 6 aren't synergistic. I think that they rhyme. So, like, what I mean when I say that is you get individuals, like if we're going to just stereotype people to kind of represent those levels, you have the hyper religious, 4 who is, goes to church every Sunday. And then you have, and is more conservative, right? And then you have the hippie, new age spiritual person who is practicing magic. Both engage in magical thinking, right? Both are subjective and collective. However, the way it manifests is different because the person who's more centered at 4 hasn't gone through 5, hasn't rejected 5 and gone back to a variation on 4. And I think that that's usually where you see with for instance, the new age spiritual person is spiritual as opposed to religious, because religion is a communal part of a group identity, and spirituality is still a form of religious thinking. However, it's more individualistic, so they've incorporated 5, if that makes sense. So like they rhyme. Like there's similarities and differences, but the perspective is still, similar, or in terms of like what they value.
Yeah. But I think I'm going to go with that. There's a similarity between the two, but
Yeah.
I'd argue that in a way the difference between the collective subjectives of 4 and 6 is somewhat similar to the difference between like the way 4 operates and the way that 5 does, funnily enough. Like sure, we typically think of 5 as highly individualistic, and there is definitely good merit to that. But to an extent, 5 still cares about the collective serving something of a purpose, specifically only insofar as it makes sense within the context of how we understand the world for such a collective to operate. In a way, this is why the political environment in modern societies tends to be quite heated. It's not just when things get polarized. Like even when there isn't much political polarization going on and people are simply debating over, what policies are best to implement, you're sort of seeing the collective aspect of 5 at work in that context. It's not like everyone's looking out for themselves. They're more so looking out for the interests of as many individuals as they can. And while that might seem individualistic on the surface, that's only about as individualistic as a level 4 would be in trying to suit the interests of as many other individuals as possible. Like, in a way, there's a certain collective aspect to 5 as well that also exists
Well, I mean, 5
and
incorporates
is
4.
just as radically different from the collective aspect of how 4 operates.
Yeah, well, I would say that 5, someone who's based in 5 would incorporate 4 still, right? So they would still have, it is about what they value more. And I think that,
Well, yeah, if they got there in a healthy manner, I think they
yeah,
would incorporate the lessons they learned at 4. They could also just go the other way a bit too hard and reject what 4 had brought for them.
yeah. And I think that
Uh,
that's what people
6
go
can have a
through.
similar problem.
Well, I think that one slide was,
So I have a question
yeah, go ahead.
Good.
for the both of you. Do you guys think that the primary purpose, that the primary motivation for dividing and for bifurcating our understanding of these levels the way we are is so that we can understand the similarities and the contrasts, so that we can have a better understanding of them ourselves? Is that the main reason for emphasizing their similarities and differences, so that we can have a better grasp of them?
I mean, yeah, I mean, bear in mind this is supposed to serve as like a general guide on how you should understand and move up the levels, so it should at least serve that purpose, right?
Well, I think that you could tell the difference between a 4 and a 6 with how they treat 5. 4s tend to be indifferent to 5, as opposed to 6s tend to be extremely hostile. And I think that
That's not really true.
I
4s tend to be quite hostile to its presence as well. I remind you of how naturalists were prosecuted across Europe for going against church dogma.
yeah, but see, they lost though. I think that,
Yeah, they lost.
yeah,
They resisted and were defeated.
yeah. So what happened was the cultural shift we went through as a society, like the going through the levels. There's these conflicts that you're talking about, right? And I think that what ends up happening is the 5 won out, right? Our current society is very centered at 5. And I think that what happens is the previous level that didn't win out, they tend to become more passive and less assertive. And occasionally you will see more assertive 4s, and like people wanting to like kind of be authoritative with their perspectives. But for the most part, the plurality of people exist at 5 and 6. So like they're just not taking 5 and 6 embody 4. So they understand the flaw in that thinking, and it tends to be easily rejected either through debate or conversation.
worth noting that level 4 isn't a monolith, right?
Yeah,
Like,
it's a,
there are level 4s that were defeated by our current order and have been pacified. There are level 4s that have rejected this defeat. There are level 4s that have come after level 5's victory and have failed to recognize it because of the way in which they have developed. There are level 4s that are outside this particular development that have come in and have been faced by it.
and there's fives
Like,
who've gone back to four. There's
yeah,
speaking
in a way,
for
and what
for
you
the sake
notice
of
is
the
that except for the
analysis.
fours that have accepted the defeat by 5, they resist it at every turn.
Sure, I mean
Because
there
in a
have
way, to a 4, the 5 and 6 ways of thinking are damaging to the way that 4 operates, because 4 relies on coherence, which is impacted either by the loss of values through an emphasis on understanding the world, or a loss in our understanding the world through an embrace of a wider set of values. It is damaged by both of these approaches, and these approaches are precisely what define the way in which 5 and 6 operate. Like, in a way, 4, 5, and 6 are all in conflict with each other.
Yeah, I'm in agreement. I think that there's obvious conflict between 4, 5, and 6, which it goes back to my thesis here is that getting as many people to 7 is an imperative, because I think that the synthesis of these concepts and understanding the importance of different ones in different contexts is part of the reason why 7 is a more effective place for society to be at. And I think that that's moving much faster than we all anticipated because of technology, because of the internet, because of I had some slides in here at first about that, but essentially because of AI, there's going to be another massive cultural shift similar to like the Enlightenment, and I think that we're already experiencing that, and we're at the early stages of that. I think that the best thing that we can do in terms of a society is to get people to 7 so that inevitable conflict is resolved before it can get out of hand. And I think that a lot of people have sensed this as a part of the cultural milieu of our current time frame. And I think that the more people that we can
Right.
kind of like, to me, the point of level check, either implicitly or explicitly, has been to figure out how to help people get to higher level, and that's kind of why the idea of how to level up was an important topic to discuss.
I think the
Indeed, I
move to
think
level 7.
Odoliv.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Sorry.
Odoliv. So this brings to me to another question. A question that the two of you kind of briefly brought up there in the beginning. You guys were commenting on whether or not Odoliv, you pointed out that the vast majority of people who rise the levels do so out of a sort of desperation, like there's something that they need, they don't currently have the reserves to contend with it, and so they evolve, so to speak. And and it seems to me that Kendra is like, okay, that might be the case for the majority, but if there is a way for us to if there is a way for us to do that without that being a requirement, if we can show them and speak to them in a way that they can find something appealing, something desirable to be obtained by, if they first are aware that there's such a thing at the higher level, and then they are aware that there are advantages that they could have by obtaining that higher level, and perhaps that desire of not having that advantage will be enough to motivate them to obtain it. Is that where the two of you disagree? Do you guys agree on that point, or am I misrepresenting your guys' positions?
I mean,
I think it can be
describe my perspective.
encouraging someone to continue. Sorry.
I was just saying he summed up my perspective on it.
Yeah. I think mine was a bit oversimplified, but the important part is across, at least one of them. I figured I'd mention the other one, and it's that this particular form of crisis doesn't have to be an existential one, in a sense. Like, it's not like your life has to be on the line over this. It's just that your understanding of the world has to be on the line, and that can be as simple as simply suggesting to someone that the way in which they have been operating might have some flaws they might want to be looking into. Basically, just pointing to the anomalies in their understanding and encouraging them to explore in that direction. Of course, the whole thing about the pointing out the anomalies is that you don't attempt to go out of your way to declare that your hope is to invalidate their perspective. If anything, you want to approach this in the direction of, I want to demonstrate that your perspective is indeed effective by pitting it up against these problems that I hope it should be able to solve, right? And in a way, in constantly pointing these anomalies out, that would then encourage a measure of thinking on their part and going, okay, how do I resolve this? There must be something I should be able to do about that. And the thing is, if enough anomalies start creeping in, then suddenly the questions will start piling up to the point where what I would call a crisis will have occurred, where the current form of understanding doesn't demonstrate itself to be adequately effective, but neither does anything else, and now a new way of understanding the world has to be developed in order to account for all of these anomalies as well as what's been understood so far. And this particular paradigm shift, if you will, in one's understanding is typically how moving up the levels tends to work. So, like I've actually shown someone a higher level using this method, just by guiding them through their understanding and pointing out holes in the way in which that works for them. Like, I highly recommend this approach.
Oh, so now, second question then. So, according to HOMAth, at least once enough people get to level 6, once enough people get to level 6, there kind of becomes a motivation and kind of an orientation problem that is then picked up by level 4s and level 3s in particular, and then it kind of threatens to destabilize the societal structure. Do you both agree with that? And if so, how do you think that it's possible for a civilization? Not possible. Do you think it's probable or feasible that a civilization can get over that speed bump, or not?
The thing is, it kind of would have to if it is to make progress. I believe that in a way, like currently, we don't even have enough people at level 6, let alone 7. And I think that the trick to getting out of a lot of the problems that we're currently facing does indeed lie in that very level that just so happens to encourage these destructive behaviors if its message is misunderstood by the levels 3 and 4, as you mentioned. And in a way, just as was the case with level 5, I mean, remember just how miserable the Industrial Revolution was. We're sort of going to have to put up with its mistakes before we get to reap its rewards. That's my perspective on it.
I agree. I think that it can and will get past level 6. I think that what we have observed historically is societies have self-destructed at level 6. And typically what happens in these societies is there's a group of individuals, usually centered at like the capital or the place where there's intellectual development. It spreads out from there. The ideas, the concepts. This is prior to the internet, though, so like would all be education essentially, and they become incorporated into the culture. The culture then propagates the meme of whatever the intellectual kind of concepts and principles that were derived by the people at the center of it. And like for instance, like you go to one of the examples I used was Spain during the Islamic Caliphate. There, they were very advanced and integrated a lot. Same with India with some of their civilizations, and eventually self-destructed because of issues, systemic issues with having a lot of people at 6. Where I think that we're a little bit different is the pervasiveness of the internet and the kind of post-feudal society that we have, where there's less of a need for the ability to resist violent incursions than previously. Ancient Rome is a good example of that. Rome probably self-destructed because of 6. And because of their lack of ability to fight off the barbarians, specifically the invasions from Germanic tribes, and their attempts to like culturally integrate them, similar to level 6. So from a historical analysis perspective, I see that their home has like a concern for 6. However, I think that the best way to get through 6 is to get people at 5 to 7 as quickly as possible. And I think that you don't do that unless you have like a process. And I think that giving people the value, see, what gets people to motivate themselves to move through the levels is as they proceed through the levels, it's valuable, it's useful to them. And then they start to base themselves at that level. However, if they, for instance, get to 6 and then all these bad things are happening as a society, the society will tend to reject it, and then you'll get the regression back to almost like a 4, because it's really easy to regress to 4 from 6, and it's because of the rhyming. And that's my perspective on it, and I'm interested what your, because I think you had a reason for asking the question, Liquid.
Yes, and you already kind of addressed it, and my question was, my third question was going to be, if your answer was yes, what did you think that we had resources to beat the odds of this time around? And you kind of addressed that. The information age, the technology, the ability for people who are at that level to kind of sound a warning and be like, hey, like if you here's the path, through the sea, so to speak, and if you don't hurry, you're going to be in trouble. We're on the other side, get over here, and this could probably be an optimal way forward. So you kind of already addressed my third question. So I'm just kind of interested to hear what Odolin has to say.
I will say another major difference between the emergence of level 6 back then and the emergence of level 6 today is the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah, I agree.
You see, back then, people had to labor for absolutely every gram of anything that's ever been produced in a very meticulous fashion. Like, there had to be a lot of effort put into everything. And as a result of all this effort that was still required in order for society to operate in the way that it did, people couldn't really diversify in the things that they did at the time. As a result of this, and since there was enough manpower to not incentivize automation enough, because they weren't pushed into the corner existentially, the same way the Brits were when they sort of had their revolution. What the Arabs in Cordoba found themselves in as a situation is that suddenly they did at least have an understanding that they should incorporate they should incorporate a better understanding of how the world around them operates and so on and so forth, but they didn't really have the means to leverage it to its full advantage. And because they couldn't leverage it to its full advantage, the moment level 6 showed up, there was absolutely nothing stopping it from spreading values that weren't affordable in any meaningful way. Like, I think the only reason why we have a decent chance of actually implementing anything resembling level 6 society is because we only need a fraction of the population to produce what it takes to make society function effectively. And this means that most people can spend most of their time pursuing their own interests in a way that they simply couldn't before. And as such, a society that is better able to leverage the interests of its people than a society that is single-mindedly focused on number going up has an advantage over. Okay, there's an advantage there, is what I'm getting at. Like, for the first time in history, I think that level 6 actually has an advantage over level 5 in terms of survivability.
Yeah,
That gives me a fourth question for the both of you.
Good.
Seeing that was the case with the Industrial Revolution and the invention of new technologies to help act as a force multiplier for manual labor, do you guys believe that the advent of AI technology will actually be sort of a second industrial revolution, allowing us to do the same thing again? Or in other words, do you feel that the jobs that AI is ostensibly going to replace is just going to allow more manpower to go where it's more needed in other departments and help to facilitate that growth into level 7? Or do you think it's going to be a detriment?
With regard to AI, I think it'll be more of a tool than a replacement for humans. I think it will once again be like the force multipliers of old, and I don't think it will do this on its own, alongside a wide variety of other advances that we are also seeing in science, we are sort of working our way up to something resembling a fourth industrial revolution. Yeah, there have been three of these.
Yeah, I agree. In fact, I work in AI. I've had these discussions with people, and AI is not a replacement for humans. It's a supplement to humans. A good example I use with AI is humans have been just getting destroyed. Even the best humans in the world have been getting destroyed by computers at chess for about 20 years now. And it hasn't gotten rid of chess. Chess still exists, people still play it professionally. There's obviously a lot of paranoia when people are using computers. However, a human with a computer still beats computers. The reason why is because of creativity. Humans, that's something that computers don't do a great job at. And they're getting a little bit better, but if you ever ask ChatGPT to make you a poem, there's a stark difference between its ability and, let's say, Walt Whitman. But where it can help is as a force multiplier. One person now, if you're really good with AI, and specifically prompt engineering, you can do a lot of stuff by yourself that would require a team of people previously. Now, the other perspective is, okay, well, now that those people aren't being employed to do these things, it's a loss of value, and they were replaced. However, a lot of things just wouldn't have happened if somebody had or needed a team to do it. And I think that that's why it's like another industrial revolution, because factories didn't, get rid of the need for people to have jobs. It created different jobs, and it moved the economy more towards other things that they could do with their time as opposed to laboring in a field all day. And that's Odilev's point. And for me, now that we're going to have more people self-actualized and less of well, hopefully, depending on how this goes, this can go terribly. But hopefully, if AI does a good job of helping more people meet their self-actualization, and they're able to have their needs met, they can then focus on having the time and energy to think about thinking and metacognition, and then that will start the ball rolling. That some people would be able to then have the luxury of advancing through 5, 6, and 7. I think that what happens is, right now as a society, we're trapped in between two transition periods, where a lot of people get to 6 and get stuck there, or regress to 5, and can't get to 7 because the amounts of self-reflection needed to get to 7 without knowing the value of 7 is difficult. It's hard to find the time to worry about these things because we have a bajillion distractions and responsibilities and things that we need to do, and our needs are still not wholly met, even though we live in a time of abundance. Yeah, I agree with DRCO. Like, if you're a generalist, AI is like the best thing that ever happened, because all your learning about random stuff is actually very valuable with AI, because you have access to experts in areas that you don't have the time to devote to, and then you can synthesize different concepts and create something wholly unique and different because you have access to these different fields of knowledge.
I mean, you kind of already had that. It just lets you have access to that stuff more effectively than you otherwise would have.
Yeah.
You don't have to do research. You just tell GPT to just generate something for you and hope for the best. It's spotty, and you don't have the expertise to fix it, but it's thought that counts.
Well, I personally have to get going. I have to go get dinner. But hope you all enjoyed my part of this. You guys all feel free to keep going. Enjoy the slideshow I did. I think this is super important I do think that other brains need to enhance what I've done, because it's, I think, just a first step. This is something that is important not only from the perspective of individuals, but also everyone. That integral perspective is, having that holistic point of view is important, and we all see the value that we all impact one another. So
Thank you for doing this. We appreciate it.
Catch you later.
Yeah.